Good morning. I'm going to talk to you today about slavery. Slavery is something that I think is an important topic for us to cover in school. It kind of explains tensions in modern day America. It explains a lot about history on how some people came to be. And a lot of students don't understand that even though it's something that happened a long, long time ago, it does have impacts today in life. A lot of times you guys ask, why am I studying this? What is the importance of this? How does this matter to me today? And slavery is one of those things that I really think does matter today because we have all kinds of races in the United States. We're a great melting pot, but we didn't become a melting pot sometimes by choice. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. So you have to understand that slavery has been part of most societies since the early civilizations, such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece. The African slave trade began in the early 1500s, and other Europeans were soon to follow. As you guys read, you read about the triangular trade. It's a little hard to say, where ships would go from the West Indies carrying rum and sugar, go and sell their goods, and then they would go capture slaves down in Africa. And the slaves would have to make the middle passage from Africa back over to the West Indies. And then the triangle trade would happen all over again. By the 1700s, the British, French, Spanish, and Dutch were all involved in this. The trade route exchanged European goods for the African workers who were then shipped to the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I'm not just talking about North America, I'm not just talking about the United States of America, because that doesn't exist yet. I'm talking about South America, Central America, and North America. I'm talking about the continents. They were traded and shipped, and the raw goods were things that people in Europe wanted. Rum and sugar were things that weren't available in Europe. So, sugarcane is hard to grow in winter like months. And so, if you guys have ever tried to go on without sugar, once you've kind of tasted it, you'd like to keep including it in your daily diet. So, it became pretty important. So the United States started to get built up by colonies. And the southern colonies really required a lot of labor. And at first, they tried using indentured servants, which people would have their passage paid and they would come over here and they would work for a period of time, usually 7 years. And in that 7 years, they were essentially a slave to who paid their passage. And when the 7 years was up, then the people had to find new labor. Or sometimes they would run off. And it wasn't like today's times where we can blast people's pictures all over the place and try to find somebody. It was easier to run off. And so slaves became kind of an answer to the indentured servitude problem. And chattel slavery started to be used, which is where if you're a slave, then your kids are slaves. And those kids are slaves. So your grandchildren will be in slavery. Chattel slavery is something that continued to exist in the United States way past when it existed in other areas of the world. Some of our country's founding fathers objected to slavery. Thomas Jefferson was one that tried to talk about slavery when we wrote our Declaration of Independence. However, the ironic thing is that he was a slave owner. There were lots of debates written about slavery, and slavery at the time in the early mid to late 1700s was kind of something that the southern colonies used more than the northern colonies. The northern colonies didn't need it because they had factories they had a different type of slavery going on. We looked at child labor. We looked at the conditions in the factories that weren't very good. And so society in the North was different than the society in the South. The southern states would not give up the idea of slavery, and it became a really issue to them about states' rights. Our U.S. Constitution, which guarantees everybody their freedoms, doesn't even talk about the word slavery. They don't use the word slaves. They actually talk about 3/5 of a person. We'll talk about that a lot next year when we talk about when the Constitution was written. But it's important to know that slavery was really part of our economic system in the South. It was part of the culture. It was accepted, and a lot of people saw it as a necessary evil. I don't think anything should be a necessary evil. Obviously, that's an awful thing to call it. Slavery definitely needed to be abolished, gotten rid of, and it took quite some time for our country to do that. So the Constitution allowed slavery to exist in our country as we became our country, even we became free from Great Britain. So the first slaves actually arrived here in 1619 in Virginia, and they helped with our tobacco industry, and the tobacco industry is kind of what built up Virginia colony. We'll look at that again next year. So just know that Great Britain, the United States, Spain, and Portugal all were part of bringing slaves to the Americas. Although when the slaves first came to the Americas in the 1600s, the United States was not a country. So slavery actually became even more important with inventions. We looked at inventions, and the big invention was the cotton gin, because it made growing cotton more profitable. And in 1790, the South produced 3,000 bales of cotton, and by 1850, they were producing 4 million bales of cotton. So as cotton brought more wealth to the South, the slaves, the value of them increased. That didn't mean they treated them any better or gave them any more benefits or anything. And a lot of people were using slavery for that cotton industry. Wealthy planters were wealthy enough to afford to buy slaves, and the majority of white slave owners, so the majority of white slave owners were rich. The majority of those white Southerners who lived in the South were really too poor to be slave owners. But all they knew is that this is the way that it's always been in the South, and in their eyes, leading a freedom train for slaves or trying to get rid of slavery would bring the South to financial ruin, because there would be no way to pick the cotton, and cotton was really ran the economy of the South. So ending slavery really became about money. So northern states banned slavery. Our state of Maine banned slavery before we even became a state, when we were part of Massachusetts. 8% of the blacks in the United States lived in the North at the time. Their lives were freer. However, they were still not treated as equals, and they struggled to find high-paying jobs, and often they were segregated by their communities. So just because somebody was free from slavery didn't mean they led a totally free life. They may have been blocked from voting or owning land or just going to school. Those inequalities continued. About half of all African Americans lived in the South, working as laborers. They were also household servants and craftsmen. Many white Southerners viewed free blacks as dangerous for whatever reason. They feared blacks would make enslaved blacks discontent and unhappy. And so there were strict laws that were passed for blacks to own guns, to travel without documentation, or working at certain jobs. So slaves, even if they were able to buy their own freedom or earn their own freedom, were not given total freedom in life. And there was definitely no equality. So that's the first part of our talk about slavery, and just trying to open your eyes to some of the history that's there. If you did the reading that I asked you to do, you learned a lot more than what I just said. But this is just a short talk for you to start thinking about how slaves were not treated equally, and how even free blacks were not treated equally back in the late 1700s and into the 1800s. We'll talk again soon. Thanks.